read his recording in progress. Awesome bio here. Mark Fenton is a nationally recognized public health planning and active transportation consultant, an adjunct associate professor at Tufts University, a former host of America's Walking on PBS television, and author of The Complete Guide to Walking for Health, Weight Loss, and Fitness. He's led training and planning processes for pedestrian, bicycle, and transit-friendly designs in communities across the US, Canada, and Australia. He studied engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and biomechanics at the US Olympic Training Center. He was a manager of the Human Performance Laboratory at Reebok and has published articles and books related to exercise science, physical activity promotion, and community interventions. In 2022, Mark served on the science board of the President's Council on Sports, Fitness, and Nutrition for an update to the National Physical Activity Guidelines. And he also tries to practice what he preaches, having served on his community's planning board and walking and cycling for as many routine trips as possible. But I think the most important, or maybe the most interesting thing about Mark Fenton is if you look back at the Olympic trials for race walking for 1984 and 1988, you will know Mark Fenton was out there competing. If there's anybody who is an expert in walking, I think that we have found him. But without further ado, I want to hand it over to Mark to talk to us a little bit this morning about making our communities more walkable and moving from pilot projects to actual policy implementation. So take it away.
Thanks for that very kind introduction, Shannon, and I appreciate it. At least you can all say this. If nothing else, you can say, I now know an actual race walker because I was one. And if nothing else, that's sort of a unique tidbit in its own right. You know what I decided I was going to share because from that bio you probably hear that I came at this as a classic exercise science guy. I studied biomechanics, and at MIT we were looking at hip and knee joint replacements and that technology. We're talking 40 years ago now. I then worked at Reebok's Human Performance Lab at the US Olympic Training Center Sports Science Laboratory. So I was an exercise science guy, and I thought, the way we're going to get people to be more healthy, and in particular to do more physical activity, is to encourage them to do so, to have walking clubs and walking programs, and do all that kind of stuff. And if any of you are old enough to have cut your teeth in that era, you know that. I'm going to tell you the story today because I think it is very related to the work that you are all doing. The big epiphany that I've had in a 30-plus year career to end up thinking that this picture actually is what physical activity intervention actually has to look like. And in fact, I would argue community health, not just physical activity, but public health in general, because if this crosswalk with this little median island here in Hastings, Michigan is making it safer for pedestrians to use their Riverwalk trail, not just for exercise, but to get to work, to get to shopping, to get to the Social Security office, to get to public services that they need, then that's a dramatic advantage for not just people who are exercise minded, but all of the population. And when we want to think about population health, we have to think about creating environments that encourage that. So that's the gist of my talk. If you want to nap for the rest of it, you've got the big story, which is don't just focus on individuals, think about the environment, and you'll have gotten the major message here. I actually did look up what the original acronym was. It's so funny, Shannon, that you talked about this, because I think that your original acronym was Society of Practitioners of Health Impact Assessment and with a focus on the health and all policies element, if I got my research was accurate. And here's my fundamental premise, that those of us that came from the world of health promotion, particularly health educators, but I would argue a lot of people that work in transportation demand management too, trying to encourage people to walk and bike more, to reduce congestion and to get, to get more people using transit in their communities, that we all came at this originally with a behavior change focus. Let's encourage people to do the right thing. Ride your bike to work, walk your kid to school. And it's wrong. It's fundamentally insufficient. It may be a necessary condition for success, but it's not a sufficient condition. So that's what I'd like to talk about. And you can actually see my progression in these two photos. Back in the 1990s, I was out leading fitness walks. There I am in my glorious pink Reebok sweatsuit. I was sponsored by Reebok when I was a competitive athlete, and I actually worked, as I said, in their biomechanics lab. We were leading a fitness walking event in San Diego. That guy's one of the San Diego Chargers defensive ends or something, and those are two of the San Diego Charger cheerleaders. They were the famous people, and then they had Mark Fenton, the walking walking guy to lead their fitness walk. And we were doing a lot of that back in the 1990s. Well, today what I'm doing is leading walk audits. I'm working with communities to try to make it safer for people to walk in everyday settings, not just because they're out for their fitness walk. So the 5 or 6 things I want to hit on really quickly is I think this whole notion of health in all policies is in fact the answer to what I'm going to call the stickiness problem. And I think that we've been talking about a socio-ecological approach, but we've imaged it the wrong way. I think we have to think about the elements of active environments and how they serve equitable public health in a much broader way than just physical activity. There are many co-benefits. And to do that well, we've got to center and empower community voices. And one of the best ways to do that is to use what I'll call pop-up and demonstration projects, these pilots, to lead to policy change. Because sometimes policy change right out of the gate is hard to get a community to do, or an agency, or a local government. But if we can try things, we can edge them there. And I think that's got to be part of our work. So again, that summary sort of tells you my whole story, and the rest of it is just bonus. As you have heard already, I kind of came at this from the physical activity side, but I think about it more broadly in community health sense. But, you know, we look at this kind of data around the attainment of the National Physical Activity Guidelines. I was on the President's Council's Science Committee there. And the distressing news here is that when you look at data based on not self-report, you know, telephone surveys, but actual measurement, people wearing a pedometer or step counters or accelerometers, you find that, you know, the national guidelines recommend youth get at least an hour of physical activity a day on average, that adults get closer to 30 minutes, to total about 150 minutes a week on average of moderate to vigorous physical activity. Well, maybe 40% of youth are meeting that guideline, maybe 10% of adolescents, and close to 5% of adults, based on actual measurement. So we have data that suggests 30 or 40 or even 50% of Americans are meeting the guidelines, all based on self-report data, like the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, which is a telephone survey, because people overestimate how physically active they are. By the way, my friends in nutrition have taught me that they do the same around fruit and vegetable consumption. We think we eat more and healthier than we really do. Okay, so that's the bad news. And I believe it's because of the stickiness problem. I believe because for the last 30 years or so, or at least the first 20 of those last 30 years or so, we really focused on behavior change programs. These are actually just 2 studies, and you don't have to know the details of the studies. Just know that the vertical axis on both of these is some measure of energy expenditure or exercise minutes per week, and the horizontal axis is a year to a year and a half in time, or 2 years. And both were 6-month interventions. In one, they were comparing short bouts to long bouts of exercise, so doing 40 minutes of walking at once versus 4 10-minute bouts. They even had a short bout with treadmill group in there. SBT stands for short bouts with treadmill. Those people were being asked to walk 10 minutes 4 times a day, but they put a treadmill in their house. And in the bottom one, they were comparing being in a lifestyle-oriented program, so take the stairs instead of the elevator, park far away at the parking lot, you know, the kinds of recommendations we say to get your daily physical activity as part of your lifestyle. Walk your child to school, as opposed to being in a structured exercise program. So that's what they're comparing in these 2 studies. But the important thing to know is they both had an intervention that was about 6 months long, right? And then they, to their credit, the researchers continued to measure physical activity rates after the intervention period. And what is notable in both is they increased physical activity during the intervention period, when we're calling you on the phone, sending email reminders, asking you to turn in your exercise diary or your activity diary, and giving you prizes like t-shirts and water bottles and fanny packs, because we love to do that in health promotion. T-shirts, water bottles, fanny packs. You've all given them away on walk to school day, or during a physical activity campaign, or at a walking club. The problem is, after the 6-month period, no more calls, no more reminders, no more t-shirts and water bottles, you see in both cases the activity drops back off. This is what I call the stickiness problem. It is not that we don't know how to create acute changes in behavior. You could do the same, by the way, in looking at fruit and vegetable consumption programs, right? While I'm on your case, you're trying to eat your 5 a day. Once I leave you to your own devices, you still live in the same world. Maybe you live in a food desert. Maybe you live in a food swamp where your only access is not even to healthy food choices. What happens? It drops back off. So there aren't lots of these studies, because most studies end here and declare victory. But when we look at the behavior change program research, we find it is not sufficient in the long term for success. We've got to do something more than just encourage, educate, improve self-efficacy. I don't think any of this is a surprise to any of you. It's why you work in this field, I hope. But I will tell you that around the turn of the century, around 2000, got deeply involved in the kind of research that asks the question, well, what makes a stickier environment? And this is one example of one of the kind of studies we were involved with. In the 1990s, Andrea Kriska at University of Pittsburgh's Medical Center had done a wonderful walking program, like the kind I just described, that had women in their 50s and 60s walking daily, and they had encouragement and training, and they taught them how to select good walking shoes and how to stretch and how to warm up and all that stuff. It was great. To their credit, they came back not just 6 months, 12 months, 2 years later, a decade later, and checked in with some of those women. And her graduate student, Wendy King, actually assessed them for physical activity and health outcomes, and no surprise, those who were still being physically active had better health outcomes. I think we all would not be shocked to hear that. The research, the epidemiological research is just so clear. For them to have maintained physical activity, they had lower blood pressure, lower cardiovascular disease risk, lower blood glucose measures, fewer cases of type 2 diabetes, right? All of that. The other thing they had them do, and this is the part I was involved in, we had them create a checklist of nearby destinations near their address. And then graduate students went out and actually validated. And the fundamental question was, is there a difference in the outcome for the women who lived in an area that was a destination-rich environment, lots of things to walk to, versus not? And the short answer is yes. What we found is women who had 2 or more destinations within walking distance of their home almost had twice as many steps, daily steps accumulated, compared to those that were in destination barren environments where they didn't have stuff to walk to. And we controlled for things like health status, age, income, right? So Wendy did a great job with this study. Here's the point. This points at a notion which now there's a big body of evidence to support, which is we can't just focus on the individual. We have to take what is now being called a socio-ecological approach to behavior change. I suspect many of you have seen a diagram like this that says when we want to change behavior, maybe your working group, your behavior change working group actually has used a diagram like this. I'm going to tell you this now. Don't be offended. You've made a massive mistake. This is the wrong diagram. We should not use this circle because what this makes it look like, because it says we have to operate at the individual level, but also the family and friends that matter to them, the groups, the organizations and institutions like their school, their workplace, their employer, the community by its physical design and even public policy, that all of these will affect the individual's behavior. The problem is this makes the individual the center of the target. And I think we got to start using the Fenton pyramid, which is the same exact content, but I build it like this. And here's why. Because I think the foundation has to be policy change and a physical environment that supports the behavior, and then layer on top of that the individual behavior change programs. And if you don't do that, these will not stick. Let me say it again. The data is there. This is not making it up. We know that behavior change programs have this stickiness problem. We can even see this in programs like speed enforcement programs. You send a police officer out there with a radar gun, the speeds drop. As soon as he leaves, it goes back up, right? Because we're only changing the individual behavior. Redesign the road so you have to drive slower and people drive slower. So it's environment and policy versus individual behavior change. When we wanted people to stop smoking, we didn't just say don't smoke, it will kill you. We've made it hard to smoke in public places. We've banned smoking on airplanes and bars and restaurants. We've taxed the daylights out of the products. There's a warning label on the side that says this product will kill you. We changed the entire environment. Okay, you're saying, you're a little worked up, Mark, but what exactly are you talking about around physical activity? Well, let's think about walking to school, because I've used that example a couple of times. We can focus on the individual. Walk to school. It's good for you. Tell parents, your kid, if they walk and bike to school, more physically active, tend to have fewer disciplinary referrals, will perform better in the classroom. Physical activity is associated with lots of great learning benefits. Not enough. Let's set up groups, walking school buses, bicycle trains, groups of kids that are walking or bicycling with adult supervision. Wonderful. Not enough. At the institutional level, let's incorporate it in the curriculum. Let's have kids in geography classes mapping their routes to school, in math classes counting their steps. We've done all of these things. They're great. They are not enough. So let's, at the community level, actually build the infrastructure that's missing, the safe crosswalks, the trail here in Boone, North Carolina, that connects their school complex to a nearby regional park where a lot of their sports programs are, and connects to a trail system that connects through the community so kids can actually, wait for it, walk and bike to school safely. And then let's go to the next step and actually add policy. In this school, which was my kid's school, it was my learning lab for a technique that I've now used with schools all across the country. That crossing guard told us, my biggest problem is at dismissal, the parents in the driving pickup line are trying to get out at the very time I'm trying to cross the pedestrians. So we did two things. We partnered with a nearby church and as a matter of policy got permission to allow parents to pick up and drop off at that church about a third of a mile from the school down the sidewalk that's right across this crosswalk. And the second thing is we put in place a 5-minute safety delay on the automobile line. So at dismissal, the pedestrians and bicyclists were excused. Kids that were going to the car line sat for about 4 or 5 minutes and then were excused to the car line. That 5-minute head start got all these kids across the crosswalk and many more, and the bicyclists, and then the crossing guard could step out of the way and the car line would move. Well, you can imagine what we heard. Within weeks of putting the policy in place, kids were saying to their parents, don't pick me up at school. Either pick me up down at the church, let me walk home with the walking school bus, let me ride my bike, but I don't want to have to sit in my classroom for an hour. It's not an hour. It was 5 minutes. For a kid at the end of the school day, might as well have been an hour. They wanted to get out. And so the policy combined with the infrastructure, right? The safe crosswalk, the crossing guard, the painted you put it together at the base of the pyramid. And now when you hold a walk to school day event, when you launch a walking school bus, they are much more likely to stick. This foundation at the base of the pyramid creates the stickiness. So I'm going to ask you to constantly be thinking when you're doing policy assessment, if you will, am I working at the base of the pyramid, right? Am I changing the environment and policies that change it for everybody and will increase stickiness for whatever positive behavior you're trying to work on? Healthy nutrition, physical activity, not smoking, all of them, this model applies. And I think this, and I would ask you, start using this pyramid. If you guys are going to image this, if you're doing trainings around this, when you're I can explain this to non-technicians in a community workshop and they kind of understand. Right? When we talk about the school thing, they get it. They go, oh yeah, I understand why though. And by the way, let's be clear on this. We have gravitated, I think, in some cases to the stuff at the top of the pyramid. It's easier to do. It's easier to put on a one-day walk to school event than to change school policy on arrival and dismissal, than to build that trail, right? Stuff down here takes longer, maybe costs more. It requires policy change, right? But that's where the real stickiness comes, right? And then let's layer this stuff on top. Okay. All right. So that's my fundamental premise. I hope that hits near and dear to your hearts. It's why you do this work. But I wanted to remind you that it's easy to drift back up here when it comes to implementation because that's the stuff that we know how to do and that we in public health are licensed to do. In public health, for example, if you're a health practitioner and not a planner or an engineer, your job is not to build that trail. Historically, right? And yet, building that trail could be really critical, or that crosswalk, right, to actually getting the outcome that we're looking for. So we have to think about that. At this point, you should say, wait a minute, Mark, you said you were starting to work on that research over 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, you were starting to do it. Do we now have a body of evidence? And the short answer is yes. I was privileged to be on a team that did an article for the American Heart Association. It was essentially a review article, and they asked us, can we be doing public policy advocacy? When we go to Washington, D.C., can we be advocating for funding for active transportation, like bicycle, pedestrian, and transit programs, based on evidence that says we will improve public health, that we will reduce cardiovascular disease risk? Because if there's an agency that cares about the science backing them up, it's the American Heart Association. And the short answer we were able to give them, after really an exhaustive review, was yes. That we now see that if you make policy changes that lead to more active transportation infrastructure, again, active transportation infrastructure is fancy language for sidewalks and bicycle lanes and cities that are designed for people to walk and bike and take transit more easily, good transit networks, affordable, frequent transit, right? Then you see more of those behaviors and you can see actual public health outcomes. So I think that's really important to know the body of evidence is there. I cite this because it's a fairly recent paper, but the reality is the Community Guide to Preventive Services from the CDC says this. Surgeon General's report on promoting walking and walkable communities back in 2015 said this. The National Physical Activity Guidelines, we just did that review, as I said, in 23, and that said this. So this theme is repeated. We also saw in this paper that you tend to see that implementation has to happen at 3 levels to be successful. So in other words, just building the sidewalk is not enough. It has to happen at the macro level of land use, where things are. So in other words, our communities have to be designed that the destinations we want to get to, school, workplace, live, work, shop, play, learn, pray, have to be within walk, bike, and transit distance. They have to be connected by a network at the mesoscale, the middle scale, of facilities for those modes to do it safely. And at the micro scale, the details of design have to reward you rather than punish you for being a pedestrian, a bicyclist. In other words, that curb ramp is critical for that gentleman and his wife to navigate, right, in her wheelchair. But is the building at the street or is it set back? Trees, benches, awnings, right, the details of design. All three levels are important. So when we look at policy, we have to think at all three of these levels. And I'm going to actually give examples of sort of the elements that we see when I do this work. When I'm leading a walk audit, we're looking for, one, nearby destinations. So we go out and look, do our walk audits in neighborhoods, but we look for a variety of different housing types, nearby schools, shopping opportunities, employment opportunities. And these are the kinds of things at the policy level. They happen in comprehensive plans. And I cannot say this strongly enough. Everybody listen carefully. Zoning ordinances. Ordinance is a form of policy. It is one of the most powerful tools we have in our toolkit. And there are so many things that we can positively affect with the zoning ordinance or negatively. And a classic is parking, right? Just how much parking you require. There's a reason every Walmart in America looks like that, and it's because the local parking ordinances probably require 7 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet of retail. So we end up with these seas of asphalt that my 88-year-old mother, if she rode her bus to that Walmart, would never try to walk across. So even if the bus dropped her off right in front out on the road, and there's a nice sign, if she has to get across that parking lot to the front door of the Walmart, she's not doing it. And so we've lost a physically active trip, and we've made her housebound simply by getting that wrong. And we can do better. And our zoning ordinance is what required that. That's a health policy in every sense of the word. Okay, so that's one. We need the network of facilities. Again, our zoning requires it. And also most public works and transportation agencies have roadway design guidelines. They can adopt complete streets policies. I am sure that is a term that is familiar to you. The premise of complete streets is simply a street is not complete unless it takes into account all 4 user groups: the pedestrian, the bicyclist, transit, and motor vehicles. It doesn't mean a bike lane everywhere. It asks the question, what's appropriate for this corridor and how do we design it for all 4 users, right? 3, the details, I was alluding to these details, are functional and inviting and create rewarding spaces. They invite you to be a pedestrian. That picture in the top left, classic example of just simple elements that make you want to walk there versus not. Think about the standard Walmart, lower right picture, versus a Main Street, upper left picture. Street trees, awnings, benches, the bike rack, the water fountain, right? The wide sidewalk, the sitting zone, right? All these things make you feel safer. Lower right, classic Walmart, which to their credit, they retrofitted, and at least there is that sidewalk across the front. But I'd much rather that my zoning required this dollar store to be up at the street as it is versus set back behind a parking lot. So that's Statesville, North Carolina. They changed policy, their zoning ordinance, to require that building to be pulled up. Last but not least, it's got to be safe and accessible for everybody. So do we have policies on ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act implementation? Have they adopted a Vision Zero policy, which envisions 0 motor vehicle-related injuries and deaths, right? And there are cities that have done that and have literally changed how they design their roads, what kind of safety measures they put in place so that it really works for everyone, not just people in cars, but people on foot, walking, rolling, cycling, transit. And I'm going to make the case, when we work on the base of the pyramid and improve the environments for active transportation, we're really creating environments that are good for all of the social determinants of health, if I can be so blunt. So when we talk about access to healthy food, we tell people, go to the farmer's market, the grocery store that has a produce section, your local community garden. If I can't access that, if the only food that's available to me is in a store like this, where it's all prepackaged, lots of sugar, lots of fat, lots of salt, right? That's what I'm going to eat, right? So access is everything. But it could be this bus stop in Ames, Iowa, when we did a workshop in Ames. This is out in suburban Ames, just outside the downtown. And the Social Security office is just off to the right in this picture, okay? Just out of view. That's the bus stop. The bus stop is a post with a sign on it. You'll notice grass. There's not even a concrete pad, so somebody in a wheelchair using a walker would be out of luck. There's no structure. There's no shelter. There's no seating. Iowa gets cold in the winter. How about a covered structure? How about a little heater? How about a schedule? How about a trash can? How about a bench? Right? Those are all things we know that make transit work better. The bottom line is access to these kinds of social services. It doesn't have to be the Social Security office. It could be healthcare. It could be mental health services. So if you're somebody that works in substance use and abuse, do the people that need the counseling services, can they even get to it? Have we given them access? That's at the very base of the pyramid, right? Can people get to the very services we're talking about, whatever area of health we work in? So to me, when somebody says, what's the first thing you would look at in a community when you want to improve health? I'll say, does the built environment allow people to get to what they need? And in particular, people without cars. By the way, we also know that when we invest in active transportation infrastructure, local economies thrive. They are more robust. So main streets are healthier when they're more walkable and bikeable, right? Fewer empty storefronts, more active local businesses. And we know social connection is better. So I'm going to make the case that access, the built environment and policies at the base of the pyramid are really essential for all of the social determinants of health, not just physical activity. So don't get caught in that box. Oh, you're a physical activity guy. That's why you're trying to build that trail. No, I'm an education guy, and I want kids to be able to walk to that school, and even kids with a single parent who's working and can't drive them to school. And they're still within the no busing zone because they're only a mile away. I'd like them to be able to safely walk to school, right? It's all part of the broad panoply of social determinants. And here's the real problem. If you look at the data, we know the environment is not equitable for active transportation. For example, this comes from Smart Growth America's Dangerous by Design document, and they just came out with their most recent one, the 2026. Seeing the same data, though. Lower income areas tend to see higher pedestrian injury and death rates. So it appears that the very places that have the least wherewithal from a financial standpoint are the ones that therefore get the least infrastructure, right? The safe crosswalks, the improved sidewalks, and things like that. So income seems to correlate to pedestrian risk, and I know you're not going to be shocked to hear this, but so does race. We see that people of color, non-white populations at much greater risk, and some groups at dramatically as much as 6 times greater than, say, the white population. But again, we see this across the country. It's national data, but you see it in urban areas and even rural areas. So when we look at, for example, American Native and Alaskan Native populations, they're in very rural settings often, but the same thing. High-speed roadways, state routes, very, very dangerous for people to make way on foot or by bicycle. And I will go so far to say that we have some evidence that people with disabilities are at disproportional risk as pedestrians. This one just looks at wheelchair users, but I think it's reflective of the risks that we see, and we see that at each age level, from 30 to 50, 50 to 65 and above, at least at the bottom two, wheelchair users are much greater risk as pedestrians than are the general population. Now, you might say to me, well, it looks like at least for older adults it's not as bad. Read the paper, the research here, and what they conjecture is by that age, essentially wheelchair users are no longer even venturing out. We've made it such a threatening environment that they've said, forget it. And now, again, housebound. They're not even social connecting. They can't get to the services that they need. So I just want to emphasize the point that this is very much a social justice issue because the distribution of good pedestrian, bike, and transit facilities does not seem to be equitable at all, and that race, income, and disability are 3 correlates of less quality access. So I want to conclude by making the case for how we change this and what seems to be most promising. And I would suggest that community-centered planning is at the heart of this, that things like interdisciplinary walk audits and planning sessions. Shannon, when I was in Tennessee, doing the Walkability Action Institute, we all got out for walk audits, and we saw the power of going out and experiencing the environment as a pedestrian, as a bicyclist, as a transit rider. By the way, we do transit audits, we do bike audits. Getting the community. And by the way, I want everything from residents who live and deal with it every day, trying to get their kid to school, trying to get to their job, to where they shop, to the local elected official, the public works director, planning department, law enforcement, parks and recreation. When we can get all those people together for one of these walks, like the picture in the top left, and then give them an opportunity to problem solve together, picture in the lower left, it's astonishing the great stuff they come up with. And some of it is big long-term stuff like, wow, we've got to rebuild this entire corridor, this road that is the state highway that's our main street, we've got to rebuild it. But sometimes it's simple stuff. And by the way, we don't always have to do this in person. Photo voice, I think, is a very powerful tool, and we frequently encourage people to get out with their phone, take pictures of their experience as a pedestrian, a bicyclist, as a transit rider. This mom, the top picture on the top right, showed her child's walk to school, the high-quality trail that she had for part of it, and then what happened when that trail gets overgrown and is no longer a paved surface, and now it's soft. And she recognizes why a parent, for example, pushing a stroller with a younger sibling wouldn't be there because it's now sandy and the wheels would get caught. And I know it seems like subtle stuff, but that may be the difference, right? And that's where community voice means so much. And then the lower right pictures, when we go out and try stuff or think about trying things, what would a new crosswalk be here? Could we put curb extensions here that would slow the traffic down? let's go out and collect some data. And we're finding great success using citizen scientists. So we're encouraging schools, for example, to have their math classes get involved in this work, or have community teams reach out to schools and their math programs. To these students are in Peoria, Illinois, learning how to use a radar gun, and they're collecting speed data, and that's one of their check sheets right there. And by the way, I can't tell you how the kids, the middle schoolers, think it's a riot, because we explain to them how you really don't want drivers to see you, because then you alter their behavior. So they're thinking, where can we hide? And we're going to be in these bushes. And we also teach them how you have to try to be aligned with the vehicle, not perpendicular to it. So there's some physics involved. There are so many teachable moments, and they love collecting the data and then informing change, because by collecting this kind of data, then you can try things and see, has it made a difference? And the trying things is really sort of the heart of my real passion here, because we have come to realize that even simple demonstration projects can help a community move toward policy change. So this is Whitefish, Montana. We did walk audits here. We identified these fairly wide streets in some of the neighborhoods that have parking on both sides but probably don't need it. It's a neighborhood street. Most people have a driveway, and they realize we could probably take away one side and create a bike lane or a two-way bike path. But the problem was many parents said, nah, nobody's going to let their kids ride their bikes to school. We're in logging country. And you see that big logging truck in the distance there? They said, parents won't let their kids ride because those trucks are huge and they take a long time to come to a stop. They have a long stopping distance. So they convinced themselves to try this as a quick demonstration. They just used chalk and these candles, these temporary things, to create for Walk and Bike to School Week. And in that week, they filled the schoolyard with bikes. And they realized that maybe if they created safe places for the kids to ride, they would in fact walk or ride bikes to school. This actually initiated a process of building a bicycle network plan and creating bike lanes on the appropriate streets, the ones that were wide enough. And they could test ones too using this pop-up technique before they poured any concrete, made any permanent pavement, put any signs up. And then you can measure before and after. Do we see more cyclists on this road once the protected bike lane is put in place? In a couple of documents that I think Shannon has or will put in the chat, I've got a one on creating. Okay, cool. Thanks, Anna, for letting me know. They're in there. So one is how to actually organize a walk audit. It's just a couple page tip sheet on walk audits. One is on thinking about these kinds of demonstration projects, and it includes a page like this. This shows some representative photos of some of the typical tools we use. And these are just 5 simple tools. Pedestrian and bike lanes, high visibility crossings, curb extensions, median islands, and mini circles. If that's all you did, simple tools like that, you could dramatically change the landscape for walking and cycling. And then there's another document in there on evaluating these. So how do we do baseline measures and follow-up to see whether it actually slowed traffic, made it safer to cross? Are there more people walking and cycling here? And I have used these terms interchangeably, but they're really not. So I just want to clarify. To me, a pop-up is something that's up just for days or a couple of weeks. It's very low cost. It's non-technical installation. It's absolutely non-permanent. Those are just cones and chalk and temporary tape and paint on a pedestrian lane that those students, remember the kids from Peoria that I showed before, that realized they needed to create because there were no sidewalks in this neighborhood, but a lot of kids were walking in this direction after school from the middle school that they were working at. On the right, I'm going to demonstrate a quick build. A quick build is more semi-permanent, could last for months or even a year. Things are probably attached, but they can be adjustable, and they still are low cost and can happen quickly, hence the term quick builds. You don't have to do, digging up concrete, pouring new asphalt, things like that. So in this picture on the right, you'll notice there's a line here that should be a curb extension, and cars should not be parking in that. It's a very faded line, but I'll darken it for you. And this is a bakery. The Bowie Bakery is a local institution, highly regarded. Everybody loves the place. And that business owner did not want them to put the vertical elements that would have kept cars from sitting in this curb extension, which you really want. You don't want cars that close to the stop sign because it means pedestrians are stepping out to cross the street from behind a parked car. Very, very dangerous. So the kids that were involved in the walk audit and the project to actually make this a safer walk to school route suggested, well, what if we decorated the interior of the curb extension with your logo? And in fact, that's exactly what we did. So you see there's the Bowie Bear, the Bowie Bakery, and there he is again. And these are the donuts and pastries you can get there. And now you've got this beautiful curb extension. And We've engaged that business, and the business owner's delighted with this because he could even put a table over here with an umbrella in it or a couple of chairs, right? And yeah, he lost 1 or 2 parking spaces, but in the end, this is a big win, and they weren't really legal parking spaces anyway. Furthermore, and here's the pilots to policy part, they have passed an El Paso City Safe Routes to School action plan and are now using this as an example for replication around the city in the key crossings near schools. Pilot to policy. Does everybody see the connection here? Do this low-cost demonstration, engage the community, let everybody have a voice. The business owner had a voice, the students had a voice, the local public works department, everybody's engaged. We realize this is a good solution, and now we can make it part of our Safe Routes to School action plan and one of the tools in our toolkit. We got to do a lot more of this, is really what I'm saying, because this stuff is cheap and it can happen fast, and it can really center community voices. Here's the good news. I do have to nerd out as an engineer. I got to do 2 seconds of engineering. My colleagues, many of them were trained to think about 2 acronyms when we were designing roadways. And it was LOS and ADT. LOS is the level of service for motor vehicles. And it's actually scored just like grades in school, A, B, C, D, E, F. And A is really good because it means traffic is flowing and it's not interrupted and cars can move freely, all the way down to F, where cars are compact and they're going slow and you can't maneuver very much. And that's considered bad. But in a neighborhood, I would argue going slow is a good thing. And the average day ADT is average daily traffic. And we were taught to maximize how many vehicles can move with a high level of service. Well, here's the big news. They're actually saying maybe this isn't the right answer. Is that really loud in the background? Give me 1 second. Hope that's not too bad. Sorry. We're actually moving toward looking at a different acronym. This document, you should all know this exists. You do not have to be a traffic engineer to realize its value. It is the guidebook for developing pedestrian and bicycle performance measures. And it says we can now measure the performance of a roadway looking at increasing walking and biking. What kind of health outcomes are there for the community? Do we help serve those underserved folks, those folks in those communities I talked about more that have historically shown greater risk as pedestrians? Are we helping property values? Are we having positive environmental impacts? Are we reducing the total number of vehicle miles traveled? Are we actually driving less? Get this. In the state of California, they have passed a law, policy, that says you cannot use improving level of service as justification for a roadway project. They now want to see from Caltrans, I'm talking about the State Department of Transportation, and this was state legislated, they now want to see that a project will lower vehicle miles traveled, whether it's by improving transit service, increasing walking and bicycling, right? Slowing traffic speeds in neighborhoods. Lowering VMT can justify a project. Raising LOS cannot. That's policy change at the state level. That's where we're moving, and engineers are getting it. And this is, by the way, published by the Federal Highway Administration. I will admit that the current administration is not big on this stuff, but it's still out there, and it is the direction the discipline is moving. Traffic engineering is moving this way. Mark, this sounds very urban. You're talking about big cities. You're talking about, San Francisco and Chicago and LA and Boston. No. This is another document from the, wait for it, Federal Highway Administration called the Small Town and Rural Multimodal Network Guide. And one of the easiest ways to get policy adopted at the local level is by reference. So in other words, rather than asking a small town to rewrite their roadway design guidelines, they could adopt the Small Town and Rural Multimodal Network Guide, which has been published by the Federal Highway Administration. So it's a perfectly valid document for a local community to adopt as a matter of policy. So if you really care about policy, then let's adopt this for our roadway designs, where they tell you, yes, you can do things like on very low speed, quiet neighborhood streets, where you don't have the money yet to build the sidewalk that you want to put over here, you can stripe a pedestrian lane here. That's called a pedestrian lane. It's just striping and the decal here, the pedestrian decal. And the important point about this, when you look at this, is the public works director said, I don't have the money for the sidewalk right now. And some people said, well, geez, this is right near the school, and people have to park there. When we have our home football games in the fall, people park along this road. And and on parent-teacher night, a lot of people park here. And when we have the Christmas concert, right, when the band plays, they park here. And he said, so wait a minute, so you're telling me that's about 10, 12 days a year. So for the other 353 days a year, I can't have a pedestrian lane because we want to be able to park there for 10 days a year. He said, how about if I make sandwich board signs that say, for special events, parking allowed? He said, and then the rest of the time, for the other 355 days a year, we can have this lovely pedestrian lane, which is, if you will, a good example of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. The perfect solution, sidewalk over here. Good solution, paint a pedestrian lane on this low speed, low volume road and work on getting the funding for the sidewalk. But until then, we have a marked pedestrian space. We've got to get more clever and do this more often. And again, bringing community voice into the conversation help, including, by the way, resolving the concerns, right? Resolving the resistance. Let me say one last example, trails, because these are a huge opportunity area. We're seeing a lot of great work being done all over the country. And I'm not just talking about recreational trails. I'm talking about functional trails that link to everyday destinations. And we're seeing a lot of creativity. People think about old rail corridors for sure, but also utility corridors, water fronts along roadways. And a great example of this, again, turning it into policy, is Columbus, Indiana, small community outside of Indianapolis, southeast. I worked with them a bunch over the years. They have a people trail network, and they call it people-powered transportation. In other words, they get that it's not just recreation, that kids are, in fact, walking and biking to school. In fact, they built their trail network off of the schools as hubs. And they use a bunch of different tools, on-road marked facilities, near-road pathways, off-road facilities, right, a combination. And you'll notice in their map, which was voted into their comprehensive plan, so it is a matter of community policy now. There are a lot of dotted lines. Those are the trails that don't even exist yet. And the message is, Mr. Developer, if you develop this parcel of land, if you put a subdivision in here, know that you're going to be expected not just to build the roads and put in the water and sewer and the power lines, you're going to put in the trail too. Because we consider this as much a part of our infrastructure in the community as water and sewer. And from a public health standpoint, historically, we would say, well, sewer is really important, right? We don't have cholera outbreaks in this country because we've dealt with clean water, right? Why is the trail any less, right? Why is that trail, which increases physical activity and lowers cardiovascular disease risk, why is that any less important? Okay, I know that's a lot for this early in the morning, and I'm pretty exhausting, but let me just summarize, and then I'd invite conversation and questions and things like that, because I've thrown a lot at you in a short time. But I will remind you, I think the built environment and its related policies are really at the base of not just the physical activity pyramid, but all of the pyramid of behavior change around the social determinants of health. And it really, at the heart of it, it's about equitable access, not just to physical activity, but health and healthcare, healthy nutrition, right? You know, it's all of the things we talked about before: housing, affordable housing, equitable housing, social services. It has to happen on three scales. Remember this. It's that macro scale of land use, where we place things. So our zoning ordinances really matter, where we place our schools, those kinds of decisions. But the mesoscale of the network of connecting facilities, and the micro scale of safe and rewarding environments for all ages, incomes, and abilities and disabilities. We have to center community voices in the process. That's how we get it right. And we can adjust over time. We can collect data by using pop-ups and demonstrations to try stuff and move toward policy change. Even if initially we're not ready to jump in with both feet, then let's try stuff and let that model the behavior or that approach for the more macro scale. Okay. I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to close this window because I think, are you hearing a giant like grinder thing in the distance? I'm sorry about that. I hope it wasn't too bad for the last couple of minutes. Close that window. We can still hear you well. Happy to take questions, chat, take arguments, refutations, anything you say.
I'm going to hand it off to Anna to man the mute buttons and such for anybody, but this is free question and answer time. Feel free to put it in the chat, or I guess the hand raisings work too.
Yeah, there's Ken.
Yeah, thanks, Ken, for kicking us off.
Sure. Yeah. Hi. Yeah, I love the whole presentation, and I really like your pyramid. The only thing I would say is for the pyramid, you might want to add an arrow, because I just feel like Americans have this individualist perspective and might not know how pyramids work, and their eye may just go straight to the top and think, oh, yeah, there's the person. And so you might, an arrow would say, it might put their eye towards the bottom.
Yeah, right.
Because they might not think that the wide part at the bottom is the part you look at first.
Yeah, right. It's not right. Because I think of it as the foundation, but it's a good point, Ken. Yeah. I think, and that's why I did that easier to do, more population impact. Those two arrows for me are they tell that story, because we do end up trying to, we do walk and bike to work week or day, and we forget that what we should really do is don't give people free parking spaces, do give them, yeah, there you go. The Safe Systems Pyramid, it's right there. Though, so a good friend of mine, Dave Leder, or maybe the author on that article. So that's in the chat. Somebody just tossed in the chat the Safe Systems Pyramid, and it makes essentially the same foundational premise. By the way, is it Anna? Somebody asked a great question. No, Shelby, about MPOs. Metropolitan planning organizations are instrumental in this work. I've worked with lots of them. And so two things she asked. She asked, first of all, do we work with MPOs? And the short answer is yes. I just did one up in Lawrence, Massachusetts, where the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, regional planning entity, helped them build some beautiful curb extensions at a very contentious intersection, very dangerous for pedestrians and bicyclists. And we're doing a formal evaluation. They took baseline data. They're going to take speed and turning movement and yielding data. Our vehicle's more likely to yield now with these improvements. And the funding question is, I've been astonished at the range of things we can, range of places we've gotten. Frequently, the first question we ask, Shelby, is what's sitting in the Departments of Public Works shed right now? Like, do you have curbing material? Do you have some flexible delineator posts? How much paint do you have from a recent project that we could use to paint some curb extensions? So found materials are surprisingly effective. We've had people take things like painted tires and things like that for the pop-up demonstrations. Just, again, low cost or free materials to do some of this stuff. Generally, when we're not, she also asked about NEPA, which are the environmental regulations. Like, do you have to, if you're going to do new curb extensions, do you have to reassess the stormwater drainage, for example? That would be a common issue, right? Are you going to change how much water is being, and if you're not changing actual paved surface and things like that, often there is no environmental impact that you have to assess. So we often even build the quick builds with that thought in mind. Let's make sure we're not changing anything that triggers a NEPA evaluation or anything. So happy to talk more about it. And I did put my email in on my slide. You know what? I'm going to throw it in here now. And you're happy to follow up with me if you'd like to, because I'm happy to talk to you about this stuff. Any of you, if you're doing this kind of work. So email's going in right now.
Thanks, Mark. It's already in the chat for those already in the chat, and he's going to add it again.
Oh, okay, it's there.
777
Thanks,
at
Anna.
Gmail. I have a question actually that I wrote down 3 questions, Mark. And I'm wondering, and I'll ask the one about limitations. So you talked about transit and the poor design of a lot of transit stops in our communities. And it occurred to me that transit is often funded directly by the state or even the federal government. And so they're not necessarily policies or interventions that we have a direct line to working at the local level. And I'm wondering if you have any advice or ways that public health can be involved in interjecting ourselves into places like that where the state has a lot of control. For instance, in Virginia and North Carolina, the state owns a lot of the roads. And so you're negotiating with the state to do some of these quick builds or experimental things.
Right.
Would love to hear your thoughts about that.
So we could do an hour on this, obviously, right? And I'm happy to talk to you guys more. I will tell you that there are some model states out there, first of all. So, for example, Vermont and Minnesota have both published guides to doing demonstration projects in the state right-of-way. This is monumental because now it allows the local community to go, and there's a kind of a permitting process. In Vermont, there's a permitting process. But I mention this because you could go look at those as models. We were somewhere recently, I think I was working on one, if I remember, from our workshop there. So others are thinking about this because these are being used so frequently, and engineers are actually liking these because it's a much less expensive. To Shelby's point, this stuff isn't super costly, right? You know, buying some delineators, paint, things like that. So I would look at Vermont, and I wonder if I have those 2 documents. I had prepared some extra slides. Yeah, there it is. So I'm going to share it with you because I'm a nerd. And second, because of that federal guidance that I talked about, there are more and more engineers are willing to think about this stuff in ways they weren't historically, right? Because there just was no frame for it. So that document but let me say this, Many don't know about the existence of the two documents I showed you. The reason I showed you that guidebook for pedestrian and bicycle performance measures and the small town and rural guide is those have been around for closing in on a decade now, or 9 years, 8 years, and yet many engineers don't even know they exist. So I would be saying two things. One, I'd be talking at the DOT level. Hey, let's look at these other states. Why aren't we thinking about creating some guidance for demonstration projects and doing these, particularly in the state right of way, which is often even the smallest, most rural town. Main Street is the state route that runs right through, and often has been widened to maintain truck traffic at the great expense of downtown businesses, right? That's a really common phenomenon in rural America. So, point one there. And point two, let's think about making the local engineers and regional and district engineers aware of the resources that now license this work, if you will, that say, yes, this is an appropriate approach, and we should be thinking about the performance of the roadway for more than just the motor vehicle. That's just a start. But the reality is, it ends up going back to personal relationships often. So that island in Hastings, Michigan, you remember my opening slide, that picture I showed you of the median island, which was just a modular unit. It can be removed. In fact, they're removing it in the winter right now. They were nervous about plowing around it. So it goes in the summer when there's a lot of activity along that trail. In the winter, they take it out. Well, that was part of the compromise when we worked with the district engineers. And we got to know them, and we actually stood out there and just watched traffic at that crossing for a while. We watched pedestrians and bicyclists try to get across. We all tried to walk across. I find that I don't come at those agencies with a "what are you going to do for me" attitude. I always walk in, and this is, by the way, a great way to bring the safe systems approach into it. I always walk in saying, I know both you and I want to see fewer injuries and fatalities on our roadways. And we know vulnerable pedestrians are some of the worst injuries and fatalities that we see. We're working for the same outcome. How can we help you? How can we work together? So even if you're coming from public health and have no formal purview over the built environment, you can say, but I can bring skills. I can do surveillance. We can help activate the community. We can lead walk audits. We can collect data. We can collect baseline data, and then we can follow up and collect change data, which they did with that island, proving that it was slowing traffic and improving the crossing experience for pedestrians. So that's why they let them put it in a second summer. And it's probably going to become a permanent island because the public health people stayed involved, kept collecting that data, which we in public health love to do, right? And make an evidence-based decision. And don't see transportation and engineering as the opponents, but rather the partners that we can help. I hope I'm leaving you
I
on
love that. Thank
a
you.
positive. I'm going to leave you on a positive vibe about this.
Yeah.
Hopeful.
We have a couple minutes. Any other questions?
Okay, so wait, great story from Sophia. In Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. The town funded two quick build mini roundabouts, state permission through an encroachment permit. Yeah, okay. So if you're making an encroachment on the roadway, they decided they would allow them to use that to make the circles. And some, by the way, states have things like festival permits or parade permits for temporary pop-up demonstrations that are just going to stay for a very short time, like only a couple of days or a weekend or a week. But the encroachment allows that. You probably left it up for months. The DOT engineer was supportive of the project as a demonstration, and they could include it in their traffic guidelines. That's excellent. Wow. We've worked with the bicycle and pedestrian coordinator in the state of South Carolina, and I'm really excited to hear, Sophia, that worked, and I want pictures of your mini circles if you wouldn't mind sharing them with me. You can email them to me. Well done. That's a great story.
So
You guys, by the way,
stop.
you guys should start sharing these success stories. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Anna, but
No
I
worries.
bet there are many of those kinds of success stories, like Sophia just shared. You guys should be sharing them with one another because engineers are always more comfortable doing something that somebody else has done and can share the experience from. Sorry.
No, I was just gonna start to wrap up. And just thank you for your time, Mark. I have just put my email address in the chat. I'm gonna ask Emily to put her email address in the chat, and I think Shannon might have already done that, but well, Emily and I can do it for now. Thank you, Emily. So we are trying to kind of jumpstart our work, our committee once again. Should we call it a committee? That's super boring. Um, call it our working group, call it our project deliverables team, where we have folks get together and actually work on some real things. Shannon mentioned some stuff at the top of the hour about working on a theory of change. What is the theory of change around health and all policies? We all have an idea in our minds, but maybe it would help to actually have a schematic that we could refer folks to. There's some stuff in the literature, but this we're the kind of professional organization. SOPHIA is the professional organization for people who do health and all policies. There's not a lot of us. So everyone here, we're in community with one another doing health and all policies type of work. And so we're really happy to see a lot of new names and some old friends like Ken joining us. Reach out to me or Emily if you want to continue to be involved in this working group and slot in on some different projects or come up with new ideas of things that you might want to do. We try not to have, tons of homework or tons of research or whatnot, and maybe things that fit in with your day job. But this is really building the material base for our own work, and hopefully the professional base for other people to come and support the work as well. So with that plug, we're at 11:59 Eastern. I thank everyone for joining. Please reach out to me or Emily or to Oma, who is our staff support for Sophia. If you've lost our email addresses and all you have is the invite for today. So however you want to get in touch with us, we will be restarting these working groups probably in the end of summer when it's back to school time, and look forward to seeing you and getting to know you more. Thanks, everyone. And thank you, Mark.
Thanks for having me, you guys. Hey, by the way, I'm going to email you the slides if you want to share them with people. I'll send you the slide deck. Okay. I don't know if
Perfect.
people want them, but I'll make them available. Yep.
Thanks,
Fantastic.
Mark.
Of course. Cheers, guys. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.